Well, hello and welcome to another conversation with leaders of technology and venture capital and founders world. And today we have Sigvards Krongorns, who is a member of a venture fund and a former founder himself. And I met Sigvards in Latvia, and his story actually fascinated me because it shows both and like I met Sigwards because I read his article about how he turned from a founder to a venture capital, and I think he has a lot to share to both founders and venture capitalists alike because he understands both worlds, unlike some of us. So, welcome, Sigwards. Happy
Yeah.
to see you.
Hey, Alex. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So let me just can you share what was your founder's journey and like where you started off and how did it transit to venture capitalist world?
Yeah, so that's quite of a long story, but to cut it short, so was that almost now, what, 8 years ago? So, uh, thanks to my co-founder at that time, so we actually had this crazy idea that, hey, a fracture treatment hasn't been changed for more than 200 years, right? So if you haven't seen a broken leg or an arm, usually it's still being treated by the same old big white plaster cast.
Yeah, yeah.
Yep, exactly, which is heavy, itchy, and yeah, during the summer months particularly, it starts to smell sweaty and so forth and so on. So we had this crazy idea that, okay, so maybe we can 3D print those, right? And although the idea wasn't that innovative back at that time, right? So I think when we had this idea, so to speak, we Googled it, and in 2016, already like 3 million hits of beautiful images already were there at that time, right?
Yeah.
But funny enough, what we decided, okay, so we reached out to these couple of, let's say, people, and they were saying that, hey, actually, this is like a art project or a school project or a prototype. So actually, if you break your arm, you couldn't get it, right?
Hmm.
So this is essentially, we said, oh, okay, so maybe we can create it. And yeah, so we started doing it. And of course, in healthcare, so quite risky, risk averse industry, right? So you have to go through regulation, your prototyping, and so forth, more, let's say, more rigid than your classical SaaS start, right, for a digital solution. And yeah, it was quite of a journey with ups and downs, or let's say panic attacks and everything else as well in the between. And now, yes, Casper is still up and running. It's now these days run by my co-founder and the team. And yeah, what 6 years in the journey, what I learned is that when a startup transitions from your, let's say, move fast and break things to actually, let's say, more like a mature business, more in terms of public tenders, working with
Yeah.
hospitals, yeah, I realized that, yeah, I'm not that good of a patient person. So I want to move things fast, let's say more on the startup stuff, right?
Yeah.
So in that sense, I realized that, yeah, I'm more, let's say, causing not to, let's say, harm and not good for the company, and in order for a company to succeed to the next stage, right? So I had a frank conversation with my co-founder, and then yeah, I took a step back, and then essentially during my time, so I was also pitching to a lot of startups, right, like,
Mm.
sorry, investors.
Right.
And yeah, I developed this network and saying that, hey, actually, yeah, so I'll be taking a step back, and what I'm gonna do next, I don't know. And during that time, yes, I met this fund called Verge Healthech,
Right.
and the managing partner, so Joseph, so he texted me back saying, "Hey, have you met our other managing partner?" And I said, "Of course." I pitched him also Casper many times. And during that time, so what happened is that, okay, you should meet up. So we met up, and the next thing was, as they say, they made me an offer I couldn't refuse. So that's how I came from one side of the other side of the table.
That brings two ideas. One of them is like when pitching to like and not just pitching, but the building relationships with venture funds, especially the ones who are like passionate about their area of expertise and building relationships with them. Like a founder really can um, demonstrate that he can help the fund as well, and that's an interesting career path, I would say.
Oh,
Uh,
definitely, definitely. I'd say one of the things that in my now overall already a 2 year journey on the investor side is that there is no, let's say, uh, change, how do we better say? So there isn't, let's say, better experience by being actually a founder to understand what a founder goes through, right?
Yeah.
And it really helps to understand actually better in terms of what the startup is facing, what are the challenges, and also to properly actually evaluate and also learn and know that how maybe startups sometimes, let's say, okay, maybe not cook the books, but let's say exaggerate stuff, right?
Oh yeah. Oh,
And so
everyone
forth and
does,
so
of
on.
course. And funds do that as well. As far as
Definitely.
like it's part of human nature. And another thing I would add, like a recent founder also makes sense because I've known heads of funds which were founders back in the day, 20 years ago, and like the landscape changes exceedingly fast. So like it makes sense that you can bring fresh experiences
Yeah,
to the book.
definitely, definitely.
Yeah, I have a question. Like looking back of the roller coaster of being a founder, what was maybe the most one experience of lessons that stands out? Like what helped you like move on with your life, or one was
On the
that was
founder, when during my
yes, when
dur
you were a founder, like what experience and lessons that you would like to share with other
so the
founders?
first thing I would say is uh, definitely my biggest, let's say, strength was that I had a great co-founder. So
Mm,
in that sense, so I would say definitely we can go into the cliches, but yeah, the team is everything. So in terms with me and my co-founder, so we are so different in our mindset, in our view, and like
perfect.
total opposites, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And of course, it has those, let's say, moments when you clash.
yeah,
That being said, because we both wanted actually to succeed in that sense, that we wanted for Casprint to actually grow and so forth and so on, we knew we had that trust between ourselves that even if we see differently, that we actually know that it comes from a good place. So we managed actually to go through all the ups and downs, all the hardships, all the failures in terms of product development,
yeah,
all the rejections from investors, from hospitals, and so forth and so on. So from that perspective, I'd say the biggest learning was that yeah, building a startup is already tough, right? And building a health startup, I would say it's tough multiplied by 100, right? So in that sense, if you're considering building something in a highly regulated industry,
oh
you
yeah.
need that support system. So that's you cannot replicate it anywhere. So I'd say that was my biggest learning is that yeah, you need that support. You need that co-founder.
Makes sense. And what can you share like what were the strengths that supported each other in you and your co-founder? Like what should be the
Yeah,
commodity?
definitely. So with my co-founder is that so I was more like shoot and then aim. He would be
Okay.
the opposite. He first aim, then shoot, right?
Mm.
And so, for example, usually it was like, okay, we have an idea. I was like, okay, I can create a prototype. We can brainstorm and so forth and so on. I can go pitch whatever and so forth and so on. And my co-founder would be like, okay, let's take a step back. What are the risks, right? Let's measure and so forth and so on, right? So in that sense, I'm running and he pulls me back. Okay, let's go back to the reality, so to speak. And so
He was
manage
trying to aim your shoot, you know.
exactly. Exactly.
As
And in that sense, particularly in the healthcare industry, so I think it helped us relatively quickly move forward,
yeah,
right? Let's say comparing with other, let's say similar solutions out there. So in that sense, yeah, and during those times, particularly in the early years, so because again, so one thing is that so going back from the early days when we had the first idea, of course, I was young and naive. So what I was thinking, okay, so we'll have our first printer in 2 months. So we'll have our prototype in month three, and we can start
right,
selling in a couple of months, right?
right.
Boy, was I wrong.
Pre-selling like they teach, you know, like sell on day one, and
Yeah,
then
and
that
boy,
doesn't work this way.
exactly, boy, I was wrong. So my co-founder already at that time laughed that hey, because so he comes from a family of doctors, right? So he
Yeah.
understood more of the industry, and so he was like, dude, no. Best case scenario in 12 months, maybe we'll have our first case. I was like, no, no, we're gonna do much more faster. So, yeah, okay, keep believing that.
Well, it's also like worth mentioning, like as you said, like family of doctors. So he has a niche expertise.
Yeah,
in the health tech space.
exactly. So of course, so
You
that
didn't.
also, of course, so our first advisors, right? So in terms of actually, so the first question we had was asking, okay, is this legal? Actually, what we're trying
Yeah.
to do.
Yeah. Like what happens if something happens with your product?
Yeah,
It breaks, and
exactly, right?
yeah, how
Exactly.
can you experiment on, like, you cannot experiment on mice, or something like this. So
No,
that's interesting. Like, coming forward with the project that you have, like, can you recall another moment which, in hindsight, provided you with the necessary, like, skills, or was preparing you for the roles of a venture, like for a role in the venture capital? Like, what was in the founder's journey that kind of prepared you for that?
I think in general, it's like being a founder. So you have to be adaptable. You need to be comfortable in the unknowns, right? And you cannot know everything at all the time, right? So in that sense, it's the same thing for an investor as well, is that you cannot possibly know about a startup space, let's say industry or space. So in
Yeah,
that sense, you need to feel comfortable operate in this, let's say, uh, sort of like a bit of darkness,
yeah,
right? And in that sense, definitely it helped me because yeah, you feel comfortable. It's like, okay, I know what I don't know. Even for example, now these days at Verge, so although we would like to consider us like a specialist fund, that being said, we still realize that we don't know a lot how things happen in the healthcare, why they happen, in particular, let's say disease areas and so forth and so on. So one of the things is that we very much emphasize is continuous learning, continuous researching, and so
yeah,
forth and so on. And at the founder days, it was the same thing. So I'm not the doctor. I, I, okay, I didn't flunk out, but definitely I wasn't the best student in terms of chemistry. So what actually happened was I needed to, during early days. So in order to understand, okay, how plaster casts work from the, let's say, chemical perspective, can you what
yeah,
kind of materials you can put on in contact with the skin? Obviously, take out the encyclopedia and actually okay learn. So you learn basics, right? So in terms of how what happens if you break your arm, how do you heal it, and so forth and so on. So in that sense, you need to learn a lot. So
oh
I would
yeah.
say that was the main skill actually that back from my founders day I took now these days as an investor as well.
Do you think that's why, like, Joseph picked you up as a partner of the fund? Like, what, like, basically what a fund needs, like, what kind of a person, and you were that person. Like, what do you think that was, that, or besides the niche
I
experience,
think
of course?
so. I think a couple of times Joseph has mentioned that one of the things is that yeah he sees that I'm hardworking, and usually he says, but I would classify more as the I guess the startup whisperer. So in that
Oh,
sense that
interesting. What do you mean?
so
Like, what does it mean?
so in that sense that I can really relate to the founders, right?
Oh, right.
Because
Oh, of
I
course.
mean, so again through ups and downs, like what it feels actually is that everything is against you, right? That literally you have to in 2 weeks you're essentially your bank account is negative, right? You need to
Hmm.
payroll, and what are you gonna do, right? Nobody's funding you. Hospitals are saying there's the door, so to speak, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, you're still pitching, right, to investors,
Oh,
and the
yeah.
investors say, you're too early, get me come back in a couple of months when you have more traction, whatever, the classical, right? Cop out.
Classic.
And yeah, and so from that perspective, I can really relate to it. And of course, now that being said, I also a bit struggled in the early days from an investor side. Okay, how do you say no to a founder? Because like it's a bit too much, right? And so I needed to take a step back, which I'm now these days much better, right?
Yeah, you cannot fund everyone, like, as much as
Exactly.
they're like having the hard time, but they created
Ex-
it
ex-
themselves, in a way.
Exactly. So, but that being said, still, in order to, let's say, in my view, in these days, if you want to be a good investor, is that you need to not think, but at least be able to step into the founder's shoes, right?
Mm.
And try to understand, okay, where they come from. And that being said, you still need to be an investor at the end of the day, right? So you need to also call out the founders and say, okay, dude, I see you where you're going, it won't end well, right? Or I have my, let's say, I, I have seen other startups fail at this, let's say, route, right? So,
Yeah.
but that's, I think those were, I guess, some of the skills, or maybe something like that, that they saw me. But another thing, actually, I think was that I really regularly, and this is one of maybe going to the tips to founders, that always keep your network informed how you're doing,
Mm.
even if you're, let's say, sending regular updates. So one of the things how me and Verge and Joseph in general actually kept in touch was that, and by the way, yes, so Verge is a Singapore fund. I'm based in Latvia. So how does
Yes,
that work,
that
right?
was one of the questions. Like, how come?
So one of the things was that I had this regular newsletter
Yeah.
that I sent out essentially every month or so, and we just kept saying that okay, so our progress, our struggles, sharing okay, so what's good, what's great, and where do you need support, right? And not just to our existing investors, but actually to our wider network, saying okay, so and out of just being regular, sending out this newsletter, which was I don't know, definitely wasn't the prettiest. It had multiple times a lot of typos because unfortunately at that time we didn't have ChatGPT, right? And I was too lazy to spell check. But yeah, so and just keeping in touch, seeing the progress, seeing the journey,
Mm.
right? I guess also played a role in it.
Yeah, so like that could be classified as like the branding and the personal and the content marketing and the touch base, but keeping that open and human. And I think typos make it human. Typos make it
Oh yeah,
believable,
definitely.
and relatable.
Yeah,
So,
and I think one of the best quotes I have seen regarding this is by Mark Schuster. So actually, the famous investor who said that investors invest in lines and not dots, right? So imagine
mm,
if you have your uh, one interaction with an investor, it's like a snapshot, like a picture,
yeah.
right? And it's a snapshot of that moment at that time. But if you have these multiple, let's say, snapshots, so you check in regularly, right? Whether it's bi-monthly, quarterly, or yearly, then there already starts like a trend happening, right? So, for example, today I see you here and we have a discussion. Maybe you say that you will do this or that. And maybe in a couple of months, I will again see you in an event, or maybe you'll, let's say, send an update, whatever. And you'll say that, yeah, actually, this failed, but I learned this and that, and we're going to do this and that, right? And then again, in a couple of months or half a year, whatever, I see you again in another event. And actually, you have made already some tremendous progress, or what, and so forth and so on. Or maybe actually you pivoted, and so
Yeah.
from that perspective, actually, what happens is that I have first and foremost, I see, and it was already pointed out by Mark Schuster, is that
Yeah.
the investor sees the trend, and if the trend is upwards, particularly on the founder or even the startup, so there's more conviction in terms of, okay, the startup won't die. Actually, they are more serious towards it. They see actually their progress and so forth and so on. So, and that makes even, let's say, much more easier to make a decision whether to back the founder and the team or not.
So
So,
So yeah, this is for founders a challenge to stand out in investors' eyes because I know venture capital firms, they have like a huge funnel of companies they're trying to look at and differentiate, and each of these like founders, let's say, is interested in having these meaningful touch points. What could you advise to these founders so that venture funds would actually track their
so
newsletters or would be
yeah,
interested in
so
following them,
I
even if
think,
they don't invest in the first.
yeah, so for example, and I mean, case example with me, unfortunately, despite uh, me trying to be, let's say, as responsive as possible, unfortunately, what I have noticed, particularly in the last half a year or so, is that there are so many, let's say, particularly, and again, it goes back to the fundraising environment hasn't been the best,
Yeah,
right? So it's actually quite bad for the founders. So it's very difficult. And on the other side, on the VC side, so you have a lot of startups pitching, right? So showcasing and so forth. And the challenge, well, unfortunately, is still us investors, we're still humans, right? So unfortunately, we cannot, let's say, get back to all of them as
of
soon as
course.
possible. And so one of the things that actually I noticed, let's say, the most, let's say, experienced founders, what they do actually is that they understand, so to speak, how the game works. And
Hmm.
what actually they do is say, even if we have, let's say, a first interaction, software and so on, after, let's say, 2 months, 3 months, they just text me or, let's say, send me an email even if it's not like a formal newsletter, but just, hey, by the way, this is how we're doing, this is our
Mm,
progress, this is where we are standing in terms of fundraising. This may be worked, this maybe didn't work, this may be changed. And yeah, let me know if you want to catch up. Perfect.
mm,
So, and
mm.
for me, it's like in two, three sentences, right? Maybe a very short email, but already, like, again, it's a snapshot, right?
Yeah.
Relatively quickly, I can already, hey, actually, I remember this founder. Yeah, we had a great conversation that event, or we had a great call. Actually, I wonder how he's doing. Maybe should have a follow-up call or something again. Maybe think, okay, maybe he should actually meet this other founder I know, right? And so forth and so on, right? And actually, these types of, let's say, serendipities is like, again, with what I, as a founder, again, I didn't know how it is on the other side.
Yeah.
And now being on this investor side, actually is like, oh, I could have done so much better this fundraising part, right?
You see how others are doing this. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah,
Now, you mentioned the current state of things in the investment market is like going down. Well, hopefully it will go up in a few years. It usually does throughout the history. But like, what to do now? Because people are like, for example, I have an agency and people tell me, yeah, Alex, go work with manufacturing companies. Don't work with founders or venture funds because like everything is going haywire for them. So how would you see how like what are the like venture capital companies like main issues or how do you think they're trying to operate and maybe like a few tips for founders on this kind of situation right now, just go work somewhere else for a
yeah.
couple of years or maybe there is still hope.
So, and it's a very good question. It's a tough question, right? So, I think realistically speaking, so first and foremost is again, if you use the game analogy, so understand how the game is played and what kind of, let's say, investment target VCs are looking for. And again, different VCs have different strategies, different, let's say, thought process and so forth and so on. So I think one of the first step is just trying to do the homework as much as possible in terms of understanding, okay, so for example, if you are pitching Verge, right?
Yeah,
So you understand with Verge, so we only invest in HealthTech.
yeah,
And by Healthech, so we clearly usually say, so we have two buckets, which is the deep tech bucket, right? So next gen diagnostics, non-invasive smart devices, that sort of stuff. And we have the SaaS or platform bucket, right? You
yeah,
have SaaS, healthcare SaaS, you have digital health platforms, digital therapeutics, and that sort of stuff, right? And again, so if you don't fit that profile, so if, for example, you're developing biotech type of stuff, right?
yeah.
Or you are building clinics. So obviously, in that sense, you won't fit the profile, right? So
Mm,
what you can do is already, again, in advance, you can just do the basics and say, okay, maybe I don't need to spend that much time on work, right? Or for example, in terms of we invest in impactful technologies, right? So meaning that we very much highly regard that we would love to bring these technology also to emerging markets, right? To Southeast Asia, to Africa, and so forth. So again, if your solution is more focused, let's say, to the US or Western Europe or whatever, again, it may be a good business, but it may not be the best business for Verge, right? So this type of, let's say, homework would be the
mm,
fundamental, I guess, first and foremost. And secondly, yeah, it's unfortunately there are so, let's say, startups you can fund.
mm-hmm,
So that means, so what makes you different in terms of can you make that return? So
mm,
again, in terms of
yeah.
from a VC side is the math. And
That
then
that article of
to the
yours that I mentioned in the very beginning, like I just gotta say, like that was also finding to me that 10x might not be enough in the long run. Like it should be at
yeah,
least 60.
and the thing
Is that
is,
still?
so it depends on the fund. So actually, what is a great saying that you tell me the size of your fund, and I'll tell you your strategy, right?
Mm,
And so from that perspective, depending on the size, and actually this is what the founders can ask during the intro call. Okay, so what is the size of your fund? What is your strategy? What kind of return profile you're looking for? So maybe some, let's say, VCs may decide not to answer, but again, no harm in asking, right? Because if they do answer, then it's already like let's say additional data point that you as a founder actually say, okay, so if they're, let's say, have a 50 million fund,
yeah,
right? So that means, and if their, let's say, allocation maybe 50-50 or something like that, that means that what happens is that roughly they could expect from 20, 40, maybe 50x return,
Yeah.
right? Multiple plus minus they're looking for. And so from that perspective, again, you can do the backwards math. Okay, what kind of businesses are they looking for? And yeah, if you're building a business for, let's say, that can be like, I don't know, a $15 million business, well, unfortunately, it won't be good for Verge, right? Or any other type of that size of investor. So, for example, and again, this goes back to my own failures as a, because I actually, so one thing I usually say is that I don't know. I cannot teach how to fundraise because I was so bad at it that during even the, let's say, low interest times, couldn't raise. So who am I to judge actually and say how to fundraise? So I was that bad, right? But what I can say is definitely how not to fundraise.
Yeah.
And what another thing is that particularly going to the math was that actually one of the investors quite frequently told me, Sigvards, I like your team, I like the idea, I like the product, but it's not VC scalable. I was like, no, 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 listen, you here's the math. So many fractures in Europe, right? So and I'm showcasing him and I'm trying to convince him. It's like, Sigvards, you don't understand. It's not VC scalable. It's like, no, it is. And now it took me literally, I think, maybe a couple of months, and I was starting to do the math on the VC side. I was like, yeah,
And
this
it
this
like
this just won't gonna work.
yeah, maybe it doesn't have to, like, the business still exists, right? Like
Yeah,
it's still growing, it's still a great product, and like it just doesn't mean that you need to spend your own time and the VC's time on something that is not a good match. And
exactly. And maybe in the future. So, for example, if and we'll see how the, let's say, future holds. But if, let's say, the business does a pivot, and maybe not significantly, but maybe just on the business model, right? It can maybe again become a VC scalable thing,
yeah.
right? So again, it's just realizing what investors are looking for in
Hmm.
terms of returns, in terms of, let's say, type of startup and so forth and so. And again, at the end of the day, not all startups need to be VC investable in that sense, right? So we have quite a bit of famous startup, let's say, companies that were fully bootstrapped, and the founder owns 100%, and they
Yeah,
still are great businesses, right? So
absolutely. It's interesting. Like I have I have a follow-up question on that. I've seen a startup who was funded multiple times and a founder in different startups as well. And his relationships with venture capital companies were that he was talking to them in a like a pool fashion, in a sense like, are you basically are you good enough to invest in us? This kind of approach, and that worked wonders for him, at least is what he claimed. Like, how does what it takes to, and like if you're chasing someone, he's more inclined to, to dismiss what you're trying to say. And how, like, what would it take for a founder or a fund to say something like this to a venture capital fund? Like, are we a good match? Like, let's see if we're really a good match, if your money would make an impact. So have
yeah,
you
I
have,
mean,
have you seen something like this from the founders that you've talked? Like,
yeah,
what separates them,
yeah, yeah. And
or their
so
companies?
let's say there are founders that, yeah, actually ask this question. Okay, so why should I take your money, right? What makes you guys so special? And so for what is your value add, right? And so forth and so on. And that is definitely so. And again, taking a step back, so obviously you we don't want to, let's say, you need to, let's say, have the boundaries and how much you can push towards, let's say, being more, let's say, strict and more on the cocky side, if I may
Yeah.
say so. But that being said, definitely if you ask these questions, so that gives us an indication that the founder again knows the game, right?
Mm,
And he understands the process, how does it work, and he also understands that, hey, what else can he get out, right? Because again, capital is just one, let's say, part of the equation. You still need to, let's say, build a business. You still need to recruit. You still
yeah.
need to be a business develop, do the business development, and so forth and so on, right? So now again, it showcases just the intent and the experience, I guess, right? So from that perspective, definitely I can see that founders who ask these questions get maybe, let's say, a bit higher regard. That being said, at the end of the day, if you ask these questions, you still need to back with your startup, with your traction. That are you actually building something? What can you prove? Can you prove it in, let's say, reasonable, let's say, amount that there is some proof points and so forth and so on.
And what is the single, like, among the startups you're looking for in the health tech specs? What is the single, and this is the early stage fund, correct? So it's more of a seed
Yeah.
and
Yeah, so we're just we
that's
usually
Series A.
our sweet spot is the seed stage. So
Yeah.
we usually can be also the first capital, but yeah, usually it's like post your angel round and so on.
Like if you have all potential parameters in the world you could select from, like what would be the golden thing that gives you the biggest chance of success? Like because I've heard mostly people look at the founders' previous successes mainly, but of course not everyone has that. But what you're looking at in a company, or this is some kind of
So
traction, or like the speed
yeah,
of traction, or like what speed of delivery was that?
yeah. So I think in our case, so again, you cannot, let's say, put apples and oranges together in terms of, for
Mm,
example, if you have a device that needs clinical approval, right,
yeah,
trials and so, versus a digital health platform, right, that you can start
makes
selling from
sense.
day one.
Makes
So in
sense.
that sense, we have actually different criteria what we look for depending on the type of the startup. But I guess the underlying fundamentals could be in that sense that first and foremost it helps if you have a relevant background and or experience. That being said, is definitely not a, let's say, disqualifying feature if you don't. That being said, what we look for is that insight. So, what do you know that others don't know?
Mm,
What do
and
you
fair
know? Or
advantage.
yeah, it was well, even if it's either a yeah competitive advantage or in that sense that what else everyone seems to get wrong that
Mm.
you think you're right, right? What is it? What right? What makes you believe that yeah, everyone's going to do right and you need to actually to go left to solve this problem, right? Or something like that. So we try to find something, yeah, something to I usually say it's something to hold on to
Mm.
that triggers that interest. Something different. Because let's take an example. So, mental health, right? So, everyone talks about it. Everyone knows it's a big issue. We have big players, small players, heavily funded, less funded, and so forth and so on. At the same time, statistically speaking, we just getting worse and worse. So,
Yeah.
what's the problem? Yeah. Right? So, we have apps. We have, again, yeah, we don't have enough therapists. We don't have enough reimbursement. We have huge queues. At the same time, we have apps and nobody use them or use them irregularly or something like that, right? So what it gives. And so if a startup comes in pitching, let's say your 100th time, we're going to build a platform matching therapists with patients. I was like, okay, and what else?
What's
What
new?
else? What's new, right? And again, now that being said, they can showcase traction. Like, I will say, okay, show me the traction. If they have a traction, so why are they using it? What's the story? What makes it particular this type of app and not this competitive app, right?
Yeah,
And so
so
forth.
it should be something new and something like proven at the same time, because like I can imagine a lot of new things, but doesn't mean that they would be
So
like how do you
if
look for the
you,
proof?
yeah, so exactly. So that's the thing. So if you cannot prove it, you need to be, let's say, something unique or something we haven't heard before.
Mm.
Or if you are building, let's say you are there are multiple, many hundreds of, let's say, mental health stars out there. Okay, then show us what is the difference. Is it traction? Is it a persona? Is it a niche? Let's say space or vertical, whatever. Show us what's different, right? And then of course we'll ask, okay, so what's the traction, so forth and so on. But if you're claiming that, yeah, we're different, how, right? Then show us.
Um, that's interesting because like that brings me to my thoughts. Like before I went and look and got empathy towards venture funds, I was looking at them with, like people who with a lot of crowns on their heads with the pockets full of money, like essentially, like, I will like, I like you, I give you money, I don't like you, I don't give you money, this kind of thing. like on yachts
Well,
and stuff like that. And the reality is like quite a bit different. This is, and there's another take on it that there's a people who deliberately like who are idealists with some money borrowed from other other people, maybe rich ones with money, and who have well, like going in an extremely risky minefield with a lot of unknowns, like trying to chart the uncharted territories. Like what do you feel is more right? Like what are the like how do I approach a VC fund if you want to work in one, if you want to like at least understand how they think, to be empathic towards like their journey. Like how do you
yes,
see current fund and their
yeah,
situation? And
yeah.
like
So I think one thing to learn understand about venture capital funds is that again, different types of venture capital funds. So you have solo GPs or
yeah,
general partners, right? So small firms, larger firms that have, let's say, huge backroom staff and so forth and so on. So depending on the type of the, let's say, venture capital firm. But at the end of the day, if you look at the statistics, so majority actually return less than what that our investors have invested, right? So meaning
yeah,
that venture capital firms actually lose money like statistically as well. So
yeah.
that means that venture capital firms also, and again, what's interesting when I look at now looking at the VC side is that venture capital firms also are fundraising to LPs, which are the limited partners of the funds investors. And the dynamics pretty much the same, actually.
Yeah.
Of course, what I have seen so far, right? And in that sense, again, investors expect that 3x return for a fund, right?
Yeah.
So from that perspective, if a founder, and again, this is like again, founders shouldn't to care too much, right? But that being said, it helps if you understand where the let's say VC comes from, and if you realize that okay, majority of VCs will lose money, and if they are, for example, on their first fund or second fund and they're just starting out, maybe actually they need that home run, right? They want to
Mm,
prove themselves.
yeah.
So maybe they are more risk prone or maybe risk averse, right? So you need to understand where they come from and how to pitch them, how to tailor your pitch, right? So because some VCs are saying, okay, I know that 9 out of 10 I will lose money, but that 10 will return my essentially all the let's say losses
Yeah, yeah.
multiplied by three, right? On the other hand, some VCs are more cautious. So, for example, they know that, okay, I will lose my money on, let's say, on the half of it, let's say five, two will return maybe 2x, 3x, and two will return a good chunk, right? And so, and again, different strategy. And again, this is what you can ask as a founder to the
Yeah.
VC in terms of, okay, how do you think about startup investing? And so with Verge, we are relatively always quite transparent. Is that saying, okay, so in addition to returns, what we look for also is that impact, right? So
Mm,
if you can reach to millions of lives helped, right? And I don't know, in Bangladesh, in India, or in Nigeria, and so on, then of course, even if you won't have, let's say, within a reason, let's say the most, let's say, stellar
100x.
projections,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. So we will still consider it, right? Because so in addition to let's say health tech, we also look for that impact. Now, on the other hand, other VCs will say that, yeah, no, I want that 100x, right? And so forth and so on. So again, do the homework.
Yeah, well, thanks. Like the two trends, what you're saying, like do the homework, research the like each particular venture capital company or uh, yeah, or organization and do the
And
maths on their behalf.
and this actually another thing is that so VCs, particularly these days, are a very talkative bunch.
Hmm.
So, particularly on various kinds of platforms, I think most
S-
of the VCs have either a Medium or a Substack. So,
mhm.
so what you can do is definitely just look them up and see what they write about, what they're
Hmm.
passionate about, or what they claim, right? Uh, yeah, go on different listen to what they're saying on podcasts, right?
Hmm.
And again, so it will give you a sense of insight in terms of what they're thinking, and that won't, let's say, make a very huge difference, but it will give you a bit of, let's say, edge in terms of, okay, so do I tailor my pitch a bit that way or this way? And yeah, whether he's actually, do I like actually how the investor actually speaks? what he thinks. Actually, do I
Yeah.
like his style, right? Do I want to actually to work with him? Because another thing is that, well, the classical saying is that when you sign up a VC, right, it's actually statistically speaking longer than a marriage, right? So in that sense, you are stuck with an investor for a very long time. And if you don't see an eye to eye, if you don't have that chemistry, again, will be much more difficult later down the road.
So you can support the VC brand and like be try to help them in their brand journey or something like that as
Yeah,
well.
and again, and actually, one of the things that also, for example, what VCs do like, I think what I have heard at least, is that so when a founder says, okay, but how do I reach them, right? I don't have the network, for example, I'm just starting out. I'm a first-time founder. Where do I find them? Well, first and foremost, yeah, you can go to, let's say, physical, let's say, events and so forth and so on. But if you're, let's say, in an ecosystem where it's not that many events and so forth and so on, well, there is platforms. So your X. So, for example, you can follow them.
Yeah.
You can tweet it. I don't know, X them. I don't know, tweet them, whatever it's called these days. But yeah, actually, respond to them, ask questions, maybe, right? Or engage with them, and you'd be surprised actually how many VC actually read those tweets, how many respond to those tweets, right? And yeah, you would imagine, let's say, a VC that has hundreds of millions of assets under management or many famous portfolio companies and so forth and so on. At one point, they just reply to you in a DM or something like that. You go, wow, right?
It's
So
yeah, it's interesting as a trend. I see that like in the last few years, basically VCs are getting more and more open and more transparent and more connect. Like before that, they were like closed institute. At least it's what it feels like to me. So, what do you think are VCs like? And you as a founder, you can try to support their communication challenges and their branding challenges. So can it like maybe a little bit about that? What do you see in the changes in the VC landscape on that behalf, and like how venture capital companies are trying to build their brand? What are they trying to do? What they're failing maybe even at doing in their communication to founders or to the markets and to everything? Like what do you see changes in that
yeah,
landscape?
yeah. So I think there are quite a bit of changes happening these days, and first and foremost is just trying to be more transparent. So
Mm,
what we like, what we dislike, where what actually we invest, what we don't invest, right? Because the challenge biggest was, going back to my early days, was that understanding how VCs think, why
yeah,
they think, right? So because, and again, full transparency. So I, again, now on the being on the underside, I also have responded, unfortunately, with the classical, please, you are a bit too early for us. Can you keep us posted, right? Which is the classical cop out answer, and so forth and so on, which I really dislike, to be honest.
hmm,
But unfortunately, due to the time constraints, I cannot respond, let's say, with a detailed feedback to every single startup.
of course.
And but that being said, so one thing that VCs are now doing, and I think will be going more in terms of just being open in terms of what they like, what they dislike, how they think, what they look for, and so forth and so on. Because at the end of the day, it's just capital, right? So how do you stand out? Because let's say a dollar from a Verge or a dollar from another fund, it's still a dollar, right? So what else is there, right? And what else is there in terms of value add? What kind of, let's say, knowledge do you have? Can you provide me with introductions, with network, with uh, do other portfolio companies in your fund can be potential our clients or let's say our suppliers or something like that, right? So in that sense, I think VCs can more showcase the value add and not
Mm,
just tell, but and the same as they asked the founders is show. So proof points, right? How did you have helped, right? Being transparent, for example, with Verge. So what we actually highly regard with us is that we now this year we took our six of our portfolio companies for the second time to Arab Health in Dubai,
yeah.
and actually for 1 week. So it's I would say it's considered the biggest trade show in healthcare, medical trade show in the world. And for those 6 hours for that week, essentially me and the rest of the team is essentially sales reps and supporting them. So you have your hospitals, you have your distributors, and so forth and so on. And we just have a booth for them and let them loose, right? And support them. So that's like one concrete example how, for example, Verge, we can help you is if you are a portfolio company with us, know that at the beginning of each year, so at Arab Health, we'll have a booth, right? And you'll have that opportunity once you're ready to go to that part of the world and actually network and so forth and so on. So that's like one classical example. And there are so many others, right? So, and again, this is what you can ask as a founder to the VC. Show me, how have you helped? Can you give it an example?
I like the marriage analogy. Like I can't stop thinking about it because once again, when we were working, like let's say with Joseph, and he was so kind and he provided a lot of expertise in like when a founder is stuck in some ways, and sometimes these advisory parts like don't mean a lot. It's just a name with a beautiful brand of Harvard or whatever associated with it. But then sometimes these people do really care about their companies by action, and
Exactly. And then
what you
it
said.
should, yeah, and it should, in my view, it should be a two-way street, right? So
Yeah,
if we're asking the founders, okay, prove in terms of can you deliver, right? In terms of traction and so forth and so on, it should be other way as well in terms of okay, proof that you actually have helped a founder. Can you actually showcase in terms of how have you helped, right? Whether it's taking them to Arab Health or introducing them or something like that. Because
yeah.
again, that's a way how you stand out in a world where let's say capital is capital, right? It doesn't matter which fund it comes from.
Yeah, just wrapping this conversation up. Thanks for the insights, like for founders and maybe for venture companies as well. What is your personal like what would make you personally happy on your journey, like going forward? Like what do you see as where you could contribute to the change in the venture capital world and founders world? What do you think that could be?
I what so what would make me happy? That's a very good question. Um, I, I think in my journey, so what would definitely I'm looking for that impact, but to be more precise, I would like to see, particularly in the part where I come from, so in Latvia. So
Baltic
if we have
ecosystem.
that, yeah, and Baltics in general, but
Yeah.
particularly in Latvia in terms of health tech. So what would really make me happy is that we actually have health tech first and foremost, like that actually can be big ones, and so because we have an ecosystem here, but
Yeah.
and since we are next door neighbors to Estonia, who's much more experienced than us, and so forth and so on. So that I guess that would be one thing that I would love to actually to put more spotlights on the Latvian health tech ecosystem.
Yeah.
But in general, I think on a global scale, I think the Baltic founders have very good opportunity
Yeah, it's
and
growing. It's growing a
seeing
lot.
exactly.
Lithuanian and Estonian and Latvian is catching up really fast. Like,
Yeah, and so I think that would be definitely would excite me very much if I, with my, I don't know, experience or I don't know, some couple of, let's say, golden nuggets or whatever, I could help the ecosystem here regionally actually to grow and have that first health tech unicorn in the region.
awesome. Awesome. That how to grow the first health tech unicorn in Latvia will make a header of this whole
Well, I will
thing.
settle for Baltics. I will settle for Baltics because I have a couple of them in mind already. Who could be those?
I like the mantra of, like think globally but grow locally and like support the ecosystem locally as
Yeah,
well. It sounds awesome. Well,
yeah. So that I think that my final note here would be that
yeah,
uh, since Verge is a global fund, I what I can see in our fund, we see the whole world in that sense. So our let's say startups we have meet again from Africa to
yeah,
US and Southeast Asia, right? So we see a bunch of them, and sometimes a local founder, particularly in the Baltics, maybe you see the world turning around you here, right? And you maybe think that okay, the rest of the world is similar, but actually it's different, and you maybe sometimes forget how big is the world and what kind of opportunities are there, right? So one thing is to consider is that even, for example, if you don't succeed or it seems that nobody wants your solution in this part of the world, maybe look beyond it, right? Because so again, life example. So I met a founder and I clearly see that, yeah, in this part of the world, nobody wants that health tech solution. But I told him actually a couple of weeks ago, pack your bags, go to Thailand, and I can guarantee in a couple of months, if you do the same work, you'll have your first paid clients.
Awesome. I think this is awesome advice. I cannot help but want to ask the final question. Like, if I were a health tech company, and would you, well, I know it is a lot of different, like a platform or something, but is the modern trend is starting in a well-developed country, or is it starting in like, and if reasonably innovative, like something? Should I be aiming at starting in US, Canada, or like Germany or whatever, or I have better chances generally in Latam or Asian markets or
Yeah, that's like a very good question. And the thing is that from a capital raising perspective, definitely helps if you're in the more developed markets, right? So no
yeah,
questions asked. So if you're based in San Francisco, so obviously you'll have, I don't know, you meet every single coffee shop you will see a Patagonia West, right?
yeah, of
VC.
course.
But that being said, if you're thinking about building something, I think it doesn't matter these days, right? If you're
Mm,
from a developed, less developed ecosystem, and again, it only makes so what makes the difference is being close to your customers, right?
cool.
So
That's great
I'll put
advice.
that, yeah. So in that sense, that if you're building a solution for rural areas, and then you need to be in the rural area, right?
Yeah,
And you need, or if you're not physically there, you need to be at least digitally there, right? Or something
yeah,
like that. And yeah, you can start out, right, maybe in the Baltics, but if your solution, you're building a solution that's a life and death, let's say, case, and could be a solution for the rural areas, let's say in Bangladesh,
yeah,
well, you need to be in Bangladesh, right? It doesn't matter if you're here in Latvia. In Latvia, we have a different, let's say, infrastructure, and maybe it's not a lot in that matter, but maybe it is actually in Philippines or Indonesia or Kenya for that matter, right? So again, it's and again it goes back from my own experiences that yeah, and funny enough that it was multiple times said that hey, actually yeah, well, if you were born or let's say your solution would have been let's say in the southern part of the world, maybe yeah, the revenue would have been much more different.
yeah. That's very interesting. Awesome. Well, thanks, Sigvards. I think like we talked about health, how to build health tech Baltic unicorns as a global idea. And I love your input and thanks for sharing your thoughts. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks. And yeah, if anyone wants to reach out, please look us up on LinkedIn and so forth and so on. If you're building something in health tech, yeah, we'd love to learn more.
Awesome. Well, thanks a lot.
Cheers.
See you soon. Cheers. Bye.